You've got a great offer and a strong work ethic, and there's some momentum in your business, but somehow your business still won't scale. Does that sound familiar? Most entrepreneurs hit the ceiling and they blame marketing or the employee market or systems or something like that. Those things aren't the real issue. In this video, I want to expose the hidden bottlenecks that cap your growth. And I want to show you what to focus on if you want to break through for good. There's 5 common bottlenecks that leaders face when they're trying to scale a company. And the first one of those is to work harder without building systems or structure into the company. When I was a kid, I used to ride a little BMX bike. I had a Redline bike, if you remember that brand from way back then. I don't even know if they still make those anymore. Anyways, they're a single speed bike. They were fun, but you could only go so fast in those things. You'd pump as hard as you could, little legs rolling, and there would be no faster that you could go unless you could find a hill, which I would look for. What was interesting is probably around the time that I was starting to grow out of those in high school, maybe, it was probably around then, mountain bikes started to emerge. I don't know if they existed before then or not. That's how old I am. But that's when they started to show up on the market. Now you had cool bikes that could handle dirt, but they had gears. And I remember biking with some friends back in the mountains, and they had built well-structured mountain bikes. And it was embarrassing how much faster they could go, how much better they could handle, because they had suspension and so on, how much better they could handle the bumps and the terrain than I could. That taught me a lesson that structure matters. And so it's the same thing or the same concept for you building your business. If you focus on pedaling harder or working harder, you're just going to hit a limit to how far you can go and how fast you can go. What you really need to do is be willing to adjust the structures that you use that allow you to put in a little bit of effort but get a lot of outcome. So the question to ask yourself is, what part of your business only works if you're there to make it work? And what's one thing that you can begin to do to change that? The second thing that leaders often do when they're trying to scale, but it creates a bottleneck, is they build dependence into the company instead of competency. This is actually more common than you might think, especially with smaller range companies. But even at a larger level, there can be a tendency or a desire on the part of the leader of the company to really like being the source of truth and knowledge for that company. And that really creates a level of dependency where people cannot make decisions, either because they don't have the skill sets, they don't have the experience, or they're not allowed the knowledge base to do it, or they're not given the authority to do it. And so whether it's a learned dependency or whether it's a structured dependency, they can't move ahead unless the senior leader says you can do these things. As a result, all decisions, or most of them, run through that one leader. And it's just not possible to scale a company, have a lot going on, and still make all of the decisions for that company. And so what you want to begin to do is to build competency amongst the key players on your team so that they can also guide people and align people towards the overall vision that's trying to be accomplished. So you can't scale if you're the one to go to get answers for every question or even any important question. So the question to ask yourself is, who is there right now that's on your team that could step up if you gave them a chance? And my encouragement to you is to give them that chance, to give them that opportunity to step up. Now, if you feel like that's not possible and you can't find anyone that'll step up, I encourage you, look down the street to your nearest competition who's growing and ask yourself, how did they find their version of that person? Because they probably did, and they're probably on path to outperform you if you don't get moving in the same direction. If you're starting to see that the real ceiling isn't out there somewhere, but it's how your business is built, you're already starting to think like someone who will scale successfully. If you want more insight like this, hit subscribe. These aren't surface tips. These are real life tips that come from 20 years of practice. So I'm digging into the real mechanics of building things that last. So the third bottleneck that leaders create for themselves that prevents scaling is they avoid or they resist having accountability structures. Now, most entrepreneurs secretly love not having to be accountable to anyone. It's one of the great joys of running your own business. Along with all of the headaches and fears and ups and downs and roller coasters of entrepreneurialism, the joy is you don't have to answer to anyone usually. But the problem that comes with that is there's a lack of accountability. And so you don't have anyone calling you out on, why are you holding back on this? Why are you slowing down on this? Is that really the best decision? Maybe you need to make a decision. Any of those kinds of questions tends to not happen if you have no one around you. Now, maybe you have partners that you work with, maybe you have a management team that you work with, but when I see leaders either isolate themselves in some way or they create a structure around themselves where there's no accountability, they tend to not grow very far. They can get to a certain level, but then they stop and they get stuck at that level. And they'll come up with just an endless array of rationales for why it's not possible to grow any further. I remember one company that had grown pretty quickly up to about 20 million or so in revenue, and they were adamant that there was no more meat left on the bone. That was the end of the market. They had the entire market. Meanwhile, I knew people, multiple businesses in the same market who were taking off and growing. So clearly they didn't own the entire market. They were either losing it to these new folks, or there was just parts of the market that they were unaware of. And so the point here is that I think accountability in that scenario would have helped challenge some of their assumptions, and that would have been important for them. In that case, when I tried to provide accountability to them, they disinvited my opinions from the company, which wasn't to their benefit. So the best leaders create accountability structures around themselves. This might have to do with building a management team and teaching them to provide feedback and questions and really true deliberation and accountability around what you're trying to accomplish. I often find in my space where it's common to work alone or often alone, many of actually all of the best consultants and coaches that I know all have a coach that we work with, largely different coaches that we work with, largely because they provide accountability for us. We understand this stuff, we know this stuff, but there still can be hesitations that you run into or places where you might second guess yourself or whatever it is. It's just helpful to have someone else where you've told them your goals, you've told them what you're trying to accomplish, and they're holding you accountable to the behaviors or the actions you need to take to get there. It's just valuable. That's why Olympic athletes work with coaches, because it's beneficial to them to have outside eyes and somebody timing them and letting them know what their performance is. The question for you is, what's one area where it would be beneficial for there to be some positive scrutiny, some positive insight from outside, from another person, to be able to say, are you actually doing the things that you said you would do? Are you performing to the standards? Are you taking action? Or whatever appropriate accountability would look like for you, what is one area where you might need that and might benefit from that? And then the follow-up question is, where will you go to go get that accountability? The fourth thing that happens that can create bottlenecks, and this maybe bottleneck's not the right metaphor for this, but it's the same kind of concept. It stalls growth, or really what it is the dissipation of energy. And what happens here is when there's vision drift or vision wandering. Basically what happens here is you have an entrepreneur or a leader that really wants to pursue growth, and they have this great vision, this great idea that they want to go for, and they start running for it. Then it turns out it takes more than a couple of weeks to get there. In fact, it takes more than a few months. Maybe it's even going to take a few years. All of a sudden, the initial bright shininess of that vision or that goal, that excitement around it, starts to wear off because you're in the middle of the work that it takes to get there, and you're not yet seeing the payout. Oftentimes what happens is people then look for the new bright shiny object, and they run after that instead because it has the hope or the enticement of a faster emotional payout. It probably won't give that either, but it's enough to pull somebody in that direction. That's one very common scenario, especially for entrepreneurial type leaders. The second one is if you've never had a very clearly defined vision, if it was always a little bit vague in some way, then as you start moving towards it, people develop different interpretations of what the vision actually is and what it looks like. When that happens, wandering is the most natural result. You just get sort of a dissipation of energy, a dissipation of priorities, because people aren't really sure what is important because we're not agreed on what we're trying to get to. So having clarity around that and then having accountability, as I mentioned earlier, starts to help you as a team drive and move in the same direction together long enough to benefit from the results of what you're trying to accomplish. And the fifth point here, and I think you might be able to see how all of them are connected by this, is that scaling happens when leaders scale themselves. One of the things that I often say is that leadership development is personal development, or you could flip that. Personal development is leadership. As leaders, we can only lead out of who we are. We can't lead to vision. You can only lead to what you see. So you can't lead to a vision that you don't have. You can't lead through problems that you personally wrestle with and struggle with. You lead out of who you are. You are the tool that you use. And being a leader is a unique profession in that regard. All other professions that I'm aware of really come from a set of skills. If you're an engineer, or if you're a doctor, if you're a project manager, or whatever role you might have, that's a set of skills that you provide. But if you're a leader, it's you. That's really the thing. It's the way you see things, the way you react to people, and the way that you interact and that you grow people. The leaders who do the best, especially when it comes to scaling or anything like that, are people who intentionally pursue their own personal growth. They build relationships who will challenge them and nurture them and help them grow. They bring peers around themselves who will do that. They bring other professionals like coaches that around themselves who will help them grow in that way. They get involved in professional development programs, but there's always this desire to better yourself and to make yourself grow. I don't see, or I don't find, successful examples of leaders who scale and sustainably maintain the success that they build who don't also work on themselves. What instead tends to happen is sometimes they're able to take off and start to grow, but then some of these personal issues that are there remain unresolved because they're not working on them, and they suck them back down. It's important, so something to pay attention to. The previous 4 suggestions that I had are really dependent on a leader who is growing his or herself. So if you want to scale, stop tweaking tactics and start rethinking your structure. The real shift happens when you stop being the bottleneck yourself and you build a business that can grow without you. But there's one decision that can either unlock scale or destroy momentum, and that is when to fire a CEO. And that's the next video. When to fire a CEO, and when that is a huge mistake. It's linked right here. Click it now and learn how to make that call with confidence and clarity.